Hey everybody, welcome back to Tim Travels. I'm your host Terry. So, what's today? The 27th. I read something interesting, and this is kind of historical. So, Reuters news service, which is a global news service, they've been around for decades. They did an analysis of genealogical records on people in elected office in the United States, and they looked at, but also high officials. So they looked at like Congress people, so senators, Congress people. They looked at presidents, including ex-presidents that are still alive, and they looked at like Supreme Court justices to determine if any of these people had slave owners in their heritage, right? So it turns out that a lot of people in Congress had families or had ancestors that owned slaves, both Republicans and Democrats. And it turns out that 5 living presidents had slave holding ancestors. And I'll bet you cannot guess who the one is, because there's 6 living presidents, right? Bush, Clinton, Carter, Obama, Trump, Biden. So 6 living presidents, right? I bet you can't guess who it is that did not have any slave holders as ancestors. But I'll come back to that in a second. So, and by the way, it's not going to be who you think. So, the interesting thing, though, was not that we had so many people, because there were like 100 members of Congress, 2 people on the Supreme Court, which in and of itself is kind of surprising that it was only 2. But the Supreme Court, interestingly, is more diverse than I think, for instance, Congress is, because like the Supreme Court has 3 women, has a Hispanic woman, an African American woman, a Catholic woman. It has people from like, Italian heritage and stuff like that. So people that maybe some of them, their ancestors came here either, later on or were slaves, like Justice Brown. Anyway, and by the way, Justice Brown is married to a white man, and her family had slaves in her ancestry, and his family were slaveholders. So, and the whole point of this Reuters thing, because they asked for comments from everybody, was not to say, oh, this person, is like they've done anything wrong. We're not imputing the sins of our forefathers to people, right? And there's even a biblical notion of that, right? Like the sins of the fathers are not the sins of the children. But what was interesting to me is that how many people that serve in these high offices came in one way or another from people that were slaveholders, because slaveholders were typically wealthy. And the other thing to keep in mind is that, especially in the early part of the Republic, like I'm talking the late 1700s, early 1800s, so maybe up to 1830 or so, it wouldn't have been unusual to find somebody that owned a slave in the northern part of the country, right? So like New York City or Boston or Cleveland or wherever, that wouldn't have been a surprise. Now, by this time the Civil War starts, almost all slavery is in the South. But I just found it interesting that rich people you know, that people that have great, in some cases, grandfathers that owned slaves. Because remember, it would have never been a woman that owned a slave, because women weren't allowed to own property back then. But they have great grandfathers, great grandfathers that owned slaves. These people were rich that owned slaves. And it just goes to show you how family money traces through generations. Now, I'm sure that's not the case with everybody that I'm talking about. I'm sure some people have, some people have, their family's gone through destitution and loss of everything, and then somebody in subsequent generations built it back up. But I think that wouldn't be the case with everybody. In fact, I know it's not the case with everybody. So it's just interesting, because I talk a lot about, like inequality, and, in our country, I do think has a problem with wealth inequality, income inequality, and it's getting worse. And it can be a harbinger of the destruction of a civilization. And there are historical examples of that. And I don't have time to get into it today, but there are historical examples of it. But anyway, getting back to the presidents who have slave-holding ancestors, the one president of the 6 that are alive that does not have slave-holding ancestors is the 45th president, Donald Trump. Yeah, that's right. President Obama's mother's family, ancestors of his mother, were slaveholders or owned at least one slave, according to the research. And by the way, I'll try to put a link in the description, because it's a great read. Because the other thing about this Reuters article, other than what I've kind of highlighted, is their statistical and research rigor, like how they found this information, genealogical records, but also they got outside experts to help them interpret stuff. But they looked at wills, they looked at Bibles, because a lot of times family history was written in Bibles, and all the other genealogical resources. So I thought it was kind of cool. Anyway, that's a part of our history. And President Bush, George W. Bush, at the dedication of the African American, the National African American Museum, he said, and I'm paraphrasing here, but he basically said, a great country doesn't ignore its history, it deals with its history. And I think that's important to remember. We don't just say, oh, let's let bygones be bygones. We say, oh, we did this, what do we do about it going forward? And there are things you do about other things going forward, whether it's, and when I say history, I'm not just talking about like slavery. I'm talking about, hey, we polluted someplace, we know we polluted it, now we got to clean it up. That's dealing with your history, right? Environmental history or economic policy or whatever it is. It applies across the board. So anyway, Lyle, my friend Lyle over at No Hippie Trucking and Transportation, he did the best video ever. His most recent video, the best ever. Why? Because he had his Tim Travels t-shirt on that I delivered to him yesterday. So appreciate it, Lyle. But it was a great video. You got to go watch it. But what was funny about the video is that of course, because he was wearing the t-shirt, he mentioned my channel. And then a bunch of people on his channel commented that they used to like me or they used to be a fan, but I'm too liberal or I'm getting political and stuff like that. And so I thought it was a little bit funny that they said it to him, not to me, but that's another kettle of fish. But here's the thing. I had a few people whining about my mention of Trump and Trump being indicted and Trump needs to shut his mouth. I'm not commenting on Trump's politics, right? What I'm commenting on there, and by the way, it's good legal advice. If you ever get in a pickle, shut your frickin' mouth. Don't talk to the cops, right? Don't get recorded saying incriminating things. I mean, these are messages that John Gotti could have put to good use. These are messages that Donald Trump could put to good use. There are a million instances where people ran their pie traps and got in a pickle because of it, okay? So this isn't political advice or political commentary. It's just, you can call it legal advice, right? But I was just commenting on, like what you see in the papers, because sometimes people ask me about court cases and everything. But here's the thing, and then just to kind of troll people, I said, thank God for Joe Biden lowering diesel prices. Okay, let me just say this right up front, and because I've said this before. I have a lot of videos out there, but a lot of people I don't think have watched them in the past or whatever, like when I started my channel. But I've said this before. The President of the United States has a very negligible impact on prices of almost any consumer items. Unless it's a highly regulated industry where the government steps in and says, hey, this is the maximum you could charge or something like that, which isn't the case with the fuel, where our fuel comes from. Because if anybody is in the pocket of politicians or vice versa, it's big oil, okay? It used to be big tobacco, but it's definitely, big oil is one of them that has the ear of politicians, right? Let's not forget one of our more recent secretaries of state was the CEO and chairman of the board of ExxonMobil at one time, okay? Big oil, okay? Same with the investment banking and the banking industry. Those people are in and out of government, okay? And it doesn't matter the party. But let me say, so Biden, people got those little stickers and it would point at like the price of the fuel, and it was like, I did that. Biden didn't do any of that. He didn't raise the prices. He didn't lower the prices, okay? It's all supply and demand. I mean, we could go back to how much the Saudis are pumping, what OPEC's doing. There are a number of factors, the dollar-denominated barrel of oil, etc., right? But the president has almost zero impact on it. Like when the president releases fuel from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, it lowers prices a tiny bit for a short period of time. We use so much fuel that's like a drop in the ocean, okay? So I readily admit that I'm liberal, but if you truly knew me, you would also know that I'm very conservative about some things. I'm kind of a civil libertarian, right? Like I'm for, like all of the First Amendment. I also understand all of the First Amendment, what it all means. And, like when I say that your company could put a camera in your truck, it's not because I don't think you have a right to privacy. It's because I understand what the law says about what employers can do. Or when I talk about religion, I understand the Establishment Clause, and I understand the separation of church and state, and I understand the Free Exercise Clause, right? And those were enshrined in the Constitution by people that were really wary of any religion, right? Not just, they were just really wary of any religion. Because keep in mind, they all came from Europe, right? All the founding fathers came from Europe, but each European country had a different denomination of Christian religion, right? So anyway, and somebody the other day when I was praising Biden for lowering fuel prices, they were like, Biden sucks. No Democrat has ever done. They basically said, name one thing that Democrats have ever done for people, okay? And I was like, come on, man. I mean, I could take the worst, you pick a politician, right? I could take the person that's the worst politician ever, right? A person that I loathe, and I'm sure that if I was being honest, I could find something they did for somebody that was beneficial to them. And it might have only been nominating their kid for West Point or the Naval Academy. But just to answer that, I'm going to name 3 things real quickly that had a ton of bipartisan support at the time they were passed. The Democrats did. All of these things so these things all relate to the New Deal, which was President Roosevelt. But the second one I'm going to talk about relates to a guy that was a president who was a Democrat, who, I mean, twisted arms to get this legislation passed, but he was a New Dealer. In other words, he was an adherent of Roosevelt's. But so during the Roosevelt administration, right, they passed tons and tons of bills. One of those bills was the Social Security Act of 1935. Now, before you get on your soapbox about Social Security's going broke and, you know, there's not going to be any money when I'm forced to pay into it. There's not going to be any money left for me. I want to manage my own investments. Sorry, I dropped my notebook. Let me say this, okay? Americans pretty much suck at preparing for retirement, except for people that are really wealthy, okay? I know that from having worked in the industry, okay? Americans don't, by and large, have pensions. I do, but I'm an anomaly, okay? And the other thing about Social Security is that, you know, a lot of people fail to understand that Social Security isn't just for people that are, quote, retired, right? That have quit working. It's also for people that are permanently disabled, like, you know, a majority of the working age people in West Virginia. You know, and it's also, and maybe this is the most important thing, it's for children whose parents have died, who have had a parent or parents die. And you would be surprised how many people, I was thinking about this the other day. I knew a lot of kids whose parents died when they were kids, like growing up. Like within 5-minute walk of my house, I could name you like 4 families where the father had died and where the kids were getting, their moms or their guardians were getting money from the federal government, from the Social Security Administration, because of that death, okay? Now, that doesn't excuse having life insurance. You got to have life insurance. But my point is this. Social Security is not just for retirement, okay? It's for other things. It's a safety net. And I'm going to tell you another thing. I know from personal experience that there are tens of millions of people that have collected Social Security over the years that never voted for a Democrat, collected Social Security over the years and would have been destitute without it, okay? That's just a fact. But let me share you the vote tallies. I went and looked up the vote tallies. So in 1935, this is in the House of Representatives, right? Well, actually, I take it back. Yeah, this is the House, okay? I don't know what the Senate was, but it doesn't really matter. This will give you an idea, because the House, right, the People's House, individual Congress people. 300, so just since we're keeping score at home, Congress has 435 seats, okay? And I'm pretty sure they still had 435. Yeah, they had 435, even though some places weren't yet states, like Alaska and Hawaii. They became states in 1959. But anyway, 372 people voted yes. Men voted yes. Only 33 people voted against the Social Security Act. And I would love to look them up and go to their graves and tell them how wrong they were about it. 2 voted present, which just means they abstained. and then 25 were not voting. I don't know if that means they abstained or they were not in the chamber. But so an overwhelming majority of Congress supported Social Security. And here we are almost, 88 years later, and the system is still there. And people say, oh, it's a Ponzi scheme, right? Well, yeah, I guess so. But then I could name a ton of things that are Ponzi schemes, right? If you want to use that definition where somebody's paying for somebody else, right? The difference, though, here's the quick difference between a Ponzi scheme and Social Security. In a Ponzi scheme, the schemer, the fraudster, does not have the power to demand that people continue to invest, right? That's how Ponzi schemes end, and it ends badly for the people who are the last ones to put their money in, because Ponzi schemers eventually have more withdrawals than they do investment. In fact, I just watched a video last night about Bernie Madoff, but that's a different story. Another thing, Medicare, 1965, 30 years later, Lyndon Johnson's the president. He's twisting arms. You should hear, if you ever get a chance, listen to the recordings, because they recorded, Nixon wasn't the only person that recorded stuff in the Oval Office. Johnson recorded stuff, and there's a call with him talking to Richard Russell, who was a segregationist senator from Georgia. And Russell was like, I don't know, Lyndon or Mr. President, I don't know about this. And he's like, well, what's the problem? And he's like, well, this is a lot of money. And then Johnson, no, I'm not joking. Johnson says, oh, well, you know what the problem is? It's not enough money. You should propose that it become more money, and then you could take credit for it, right? And that's what ended up happening, right? And millions and millions of people, millions of people in this country have socialized medicine. Yeah, that's true. Anybody that was in the military, retired like me, they got socialized medicine. Every government worker, socialized medicine. But also, everybody over the age of 65 has it. And that has prevented a lot of people from destitution because of health problems. I'm not saying it's a perfect system, right? But we have socialized medicine in this country. It's called Medicare. And everybody has to register for it. It's a law, unless you don't make it to age 65. But the vote on that was this is in the House, 313 people voted yes for it, and 115 voted no. I hasten to add that the 115 who voted no had socialized medicine because they were in Congress. Yeah, that's right. Congress all has socialized medicine, and it's really good coverage. So there's two examples of Democrat-led votes and legislation. But I'm going to give you one more, and this kind of ties the two together, right? The New Deal and a New Dealer. Lyndon Baines Johnson, right, was from the hill country of Texas. And when he was a kid, and even as an adult, there was no electricity out where he lived. In 1935, the House also and Congress also passed, and President Roosevelt signed into law, the Rural Electrification Act. And here's the funny thing. I'm out here in Kansas and I'm looking around and I see lots of fields. There is no house in America that wants electric service that cannot get it if it's paid for. And that only happened because the government, under a Democratic president, stepped in and said, we're going to give everybody access to electricity. I wish they would do that with like high-speed internet, but that's for a different day. But the Rural Electrification Act put electricity, like when you're driving through Wyoming, right? And you see one single, dusk to dawn light, like a mile away. That's the Rural Electrification Act right there. Because guess what? There were plenty of power companies back then. People in big cities had electricity, but power companies were not going to run 7 miles of wire to that guy in Wyoming because it wasn't profitable. The government made them do that. The government said if you want to operate a public utility, you have to serve the public, all of the public. Right? That's another thing Democrats put into place. I don't know what the vote on it was, but it doesn't really matter. Okay. We're at 25 minutes. Now I got to talk about trucking for 4 minutes. Okay, so, a lot of people have been talking about these long deadheads and stuff, and I had this epiphany on this load right here. And so what happened was I was in Denver yesterday, and I delivered my load, and then I got a pre-plan to pick up a load in Greeley, Colorado, and if you work for Prime, you probably know it's in Greeley, and take it to Vernon, California. And Vernon, for those of you who don't know, is basically Los Angeles. It's right next to Los Angeles, okay? So it's not like delivering to, say, San Bernardino or Riverside or Fontana, someplace out in the Inland Empire, but it's like, go to the ocean, right? And it only paid, I'm going to give you the numbers here. So that load was 1,124 miles. 1,070 of those miles were loaded. So 95.1% of that trip was loaded, and it would have been loaded with 40,000 plus pounds of stuff that I had to drag over the tallest mountains in North America, basically. Not the tallest, but you know what I'm talking about, right? For me to get from Greeley to Southern Cal, the most mileage friendly route would have been to go across 70. So all the way across Colorado, southern Utah, then down to 15, up and down through the desert, down Cajon Pass, all the way to the ocean. That would have been the route. So 95% loaded, it paid $1.66 a mile. I include loaded and unloaded, fuel surcharge, line haul. $1.66 a mile. I refused that load. Not so much because of the $1.66 a mile, but because of what the load was, plus the $1.66 a mile. So the load I'm on is going a grand total of, with Deadhead, of 1,445 miles, 1,445 miles. But only 992 of the miles are loaded. So that's only 68%, 68.6% loaded compared to 95%. This load pays $1.67, so a penny per mile more. But here's the difference. A much larger percentage, almost a third of the load I'm on, I drove while empty. So instead of slugging it out over mountains for hundreds of miles, I drove across the flat part of Colorado all the way to the flat part of Kansas, and I've already driven about a third of the trip. And this load weighs, grand total, 32,000 pounds, right? They both would have been refrigerated. The other load would have been heavier. So even though this only pays a penny more per mile, my fuel economy on this trip is going to be substantially higher than it would have been on the other trip. So I guess what I'm saying is, when you look at deadheads, think about deadheads in terms of the whole trip, because the deadhead is going to be cheap, right? Even if you did have to cross mountains, if you're going with an empty trailer, you can go faster, of course, because you can climb pretty much at 65. And you're going to use a lot less fuel on the deadhead portion. So as long as the overall numbers work for you, don't be afraid of a long deadhead. Obviously, the shipper's only paying for loaded miles, but we're paying for every mile. But if the miles that are Deadhead are only costing us 25 cents or so to run, or maybe it's even less, I don't know. Then the Deadhead is not, it shouldn't be an issue if the money's there anyway. Not saying, and by the way, I'm not saying these are great paying loads, either one, but this load makes more sense economically. So anyway, thanks for tuning in. Yeah, that's it. That's all I got. All right, talk to you soon. Bye.